What do you make of these large gatherings that we're seeing across much of the planet and the debate over where the right of free expression sort of begins and ends? These are complex questions that millions seem connected to right now.
Well, I mean, first of all, you have to understand that the American Muslim community and Muslims worldwide condemn the attacks on the magazine office in Paris. There's not a question of that. You also have to understand that Muslims object to negative portrayals of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. And we have the right to object to that. But our objection should be peaceful. They should be letters to the editor, opinion pieces. They should even protest, but peaceful protests. One right of free expression does not cancel out the other. Both are forms of free expression as long as they're peaceful. And I think you've seen it in the American Muslim community. You haven't seen protests in the street over these negative portrayals or the most recent cover of the magazine, because American Muslims understand the right of free expression, and we use it in a positive way, not in a negative way. So that's the context that we're operating in.
The French newspaper that was attacked and where 12 journalists lost their lives responded by sort of keeping on. I mean,
it was a bit more conciliatory in the new cover. It had a portrayal of the Prophet, which Muslims object to, by the way. Even positive images of the Prophet we object to.
And I do want to sort of do more to flesh that out in the moments ahead. But we have seen in recent days in several countries protests that I think felt to some as though they were in response to the large outpouring of support that we saw in Paris. Estimates of several million people coming out, world leaders from a variety of nations locking arms and being together.
I don't know that that is the case. I think they were more, I think it was always the Prophet. You have to go back to how Muslims regard and love the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, just as we love Prophet Jesus and Moses and all of the other prophets, peace be upon them all. These things really hurt Muslims when the prophets of God are denigrated, and that's why they protest. And when these protests turn violent, it's usually in places that lack freedom of expression, so that this violence grows in that kind of oppressive atmosphere. As you said, you didn't see that in Europe. You didn't see that in America. You didn't see it where there is freedom of expression. But where you have these oppressive governments, oppressive states, sometimes these things lead to violence, and often the violence is from the state. In West Africa, the security forces opened fire on the crowds and people died. So the violence came from the security forces. So, you know, it's a more complex situation than it appears at first.
President Obama said last night that Islam is a peaceful religion. It's a religion that advocates and supports peaceful interaction. If you turn on certain talk radio programs or watch certain other channels, you hear a very different view. I mean, could make the case for those who are wondering, whose knowledge of Islam is thin or non-existent. Why do President Obama, why do people like yourself proclaim Islam to be a peaceful, at its heart, at its core, a peaceful religion?
I mean, every time one of these incidents occurs, we always get the question, why aren't Muslims speaking out against terrorism and extremism, despite dozens and dozens and dozens of condemnations of extremism and terrorism? So you sometimes wonder if people are listening. But a very interesting study came out recently in a prestigious communication journal. They did a content analysis of 5 years of media coverage of domestic terrorism. I'm talking domestic now, not international. They found that 81% of the news stories about domestic terrorism mentioned Muslims. Yet when they checked FBI statistics, 6% of actual domestic terrorism cases involve Muslims. So you have that disparity in coverage, which of course leads people to say, well, you're always in the news associated with these things. What else can I think? But when you look at the actual statistics, it tells a different story.
And I think it's fair to say that if an American commits violence on American soil, the coverage in most cases is going to omit the perpetrator's religion.
I mean, we had a case.
So I'm sure there are some who think there's a double standard.
Yeah.
Religion is mentioned when violence is perpetrated by some, but religion is ignored when
I'll give you a perfect example. In December, a Muslim teenager was killed outside a mosque in Kansas City. He was run down, had his legs severed by a man who converted to Christianity, and the van that hit him had anti-Muslim slogans painted on the outside. Not one national network carried the story. Now, if it had been the flip, where a Muslim had killed somebody outside a house of worship based on their religion, it would have been international headlines. But to this day, I tell people about this, and they go, oh, I've never heard of that.
University of Maryland professor Peter Maurici wrote an essay in the Washington Times about 10 days ago. I want to quote the end of it for you and for our viewers. Islam can never be a welcome faith in the West until successful Muslims outwardly and repeatedly condemn the violence. France cannot subdue terrorist Islam within its own borders by refusing to acknowledge the folly of secularism and require newcomers to assimilate and truly become French. He's among the view that professional persons, educated persons, simply must do more. Yep. That whatever denunciation of terror we've had, it simply hasn't been enough, given the emotion, the perceived savagery.
Yeah. Look, when you have a university professor who doesn't know that Muslims have constantly, repeatedly, consistently condemn terrorism and extremism, you've got a problem. We've got a problem. I mean, we're a tiny minority. We can only do so much ourselves in terms of getting the word out about these kinds of things. But we need help. We need to build coalitions with others in the society and to get the word out that Muslims reject this kind of thing.
And not to beat the drum too forcefully, but I wanted to, so we have the view of a university professor. I found more of a man on the street perspective. This was simply a letter to the editor in a paper in Duluth, Minnesota. The French terrorist attacks demand action from all Muslim clerics who claim Islam is a peaceful religion. Let them all declare that the attacks do not represent Islam or Allah, and that the attackers are mere thugs and apostates who are unworthy of heaven or even earthly praise. Let the clerics point out that people who seek martyrdom in order to go immediately to paradise do so to better themselves and not to serve Allah, and are thus mere mercenaries. Let the clerics call on the President of France to bury these mercenaries with pig guts. Let peaceful Muslim clerics show they have at least as much courage as the surviving staff of the attacked Paris magazine. This would be a huge first step toward solving the world problem of so-called Muslim radicalism.
I'm from Minnesota, by the way. So, but again, we are one of the key signatories to an open letter to ISIS from 120 top Muslim scholars, academics, leaders worldwide, saying what you're doing is not only un-Islamic, it's anti-Islamic. So this reader obviously hadn't heard about that. Somehow we need to get the word out, and programs like this help get the word out that we have done these things, but maybe people aren't aware of them.
Can you talk more about why depictions of the Prophet, even if they don't seem calculated to press the envelope, if they're not edgy by their very nature, maybe almost designed to offend, which for some,
the Supreme Court has an image of the Prophet in its rotunda.
Why? Because I think people struggle to understand and want to know more.
It's a basic norm in Islamic society and Islamic beliefs that you don't do portrayals of religious figures, because we believe human nature lends itself toward idol worship, and when you have these images, it takes you in that direction, and that's why it's discouraged in Islamic beliefs and in norms in the Muslim society for hundreds of years. There were some periods at time when even the Muslim world had representations of the Prophet, but they would do it, they would veil his face, they would put a fire image around his face so it's obscured, that kind of thing. But it's just a general tendency that even positive portrayals shouldn't be there, because it lends itself to idol worship, which is one of the gravest sins in Islam.